This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Our speaker this morning is Marian Quartly, who is Professor Emerita at Monash University, in the school which has renamed itself without my kind of noticing in the interim to the School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies, which sounds extremely grand actually, doesn't it? It is, yeah, that's sophist, quite nice, yes. She's researched the history of the family for a long time, and she and I actually worked on some very interesting 19th century research many years ago, probably more years ago than we want to remember. But she's moved her focus in the last decade or so into the 20th century, and she's particularly interested in family relations and gender relations in the late 20th century family, and particularly now on the history of adoption in Australia. She and a group of others had a large ARC grant for a project which has been looking at the history of adoption in Australia, and in fact has now concluded, and a book will come out very shortly which she'll mention. There's a flyer down there on the table if you'd like to take one on your way out. And she will be speaking to us this morning on the topic Reading, Writing and Recording, Adoption History in Australia, some reflections after the event. Can you welcome Marian?
Thank you, Margaret. Can everybody hear me all right? I apologise in advance. I have a head cold and I may have to sort of stop and drink water and recover from time to time, but I think I can probably make it. And let me just say, it isn't called the market in children. It's actually now called the market in babies. I could explain why. The flyer, that's better. The flyer actually has the correct title on it. So, you will have seen from my abstract that the writing of the market in babies, Stories of Australian Adoption, has been a vexed business. Had I known how vexed, I don't think I would have taken it on. And you may well ask what a 19th century historian thought she was doing, taking on a project that spanned the 20th century and even the 21st. Let me admit a bit ruefully that this transformation was primarily driven by funding concerns. In 2005, I was heading for retirement and looking for a research project with funding large enough to burst the research quotient of the history department. 19th century research seemed unlikely to attract this kind of money. But why adoption? Well, I blame Tony Abbott. And I've got good reason. In February 2005, the then Minister for Health announced that he'd been contacted by a son whom he had given up for adoption 27 years before. Abbott was currently mounting an attack on the availability of abortion in Australia, and the newfound son was a convenient weapon. A sympathetic press presented the young man as living evidence of the virtues of adoption, and none of this ideological work was undone by the revelation 3 weeks later that DNA testing had proved that the young man was not in fact Abbott's son. Abbott went on to require women with unintended pregnancies to undergo a federal program of counselling run by the pro-life Catholic counselling agencies. And I don't know what he's going to do this time. The sight of Abbott on TV confessing to his youthful indiscretions made me wonder about his decision back in 1976. How common was it for babies to be given up for adoption in the late 70s? Was everyone doing it? As it turned out, Abbott and his partner were part of a declining demographic. By 1976, the number of children available for adoption was dropping dramatically. The shift was driven by readier access to abortion, changing community attitudes to marriage and illegitimacy, and a supporting mother's benefit for unmarried mothers. Thank you, Mr. Whitlam. But in 2005, this information was not easy to find. None of the available books or articles on adoption looked at it as a historical phenomenon. hence the inspiration to ask the ARC for a lot of money for a large project on the history of adoption. And on our third try, we got it. In our application, we listed our aims thus: to understand the action of family ideals within Australian society, to assess the historical outcomes of adoption in Australia, to influence the making of future policy and practices on adoption, and to bring into the historical record the personal stories and self-understandings of the many men and women whose lives have been changed by adoption. Well, how did we go? I think it's fair to say that actions on aims 1 and 2 are ongoing. I hope to write a series of essays on the history of the Australian family in the second half of the 20th century, which will explore the action of changing family ideals and the historical outcomes of adoption in a broader context. Aim 3, to influence the making of public policy and practice, has been achieved in as far as the report of the Senate inquiry into forced adoption practices drew repeatedly on our submission and on evidence from our website to support their arguments for reform. Aim 4, to bring into the historical record the personal stories and self-understandings of the many men and women whose lives have been changed by adoption, is the aspect of our work most relevant to the themes of this conference, and I will discuss this in some detail. First, recording. From the beginning, we were committed to the aim of creating a site where people could tell the stories of their adoption experience. We imagined that the creation of such a website could serve both as a research tool and a place where hidden and silenced life stories and experiences could be publicly shared and made available to a global audience. Inquiries into adoption had stressed the need for the publication of personal testimonies in order to validate those experiences. At a more practical level, the impossibility of accessing case records meant that self-recorded testimonies would be our best source of experiential evidence. And we thought that such a site could accommodate the voices of all those involved: people separated by adoption, parents who had adopted, adoptees and adoption professionals. And perhaps participants would read each other's contributions and broaden their understandings of adoption. We even toyed with the idea of setting in a blog, of encouraging ongoing discussion between participants, and thank goodness we let that one lapse. To this end, we invested much time and labour in setting up a website where people could put up their own adoption stories, either in writing or as sound files. For no very good reason, we assumed, but I think it was me actually, that the self-recorded story would be the most popular option. And a lot of energy went into making the site friendly to all kinds of sound files, including those recorded on Skype and mobile phones. The site included an online application form with the double purpose of gathering data about our participants and serving as the permission to publish online form. This innovation pushed the resources of the Monash e-research unit to the limit and was never fully implemented. Data from the permission form should have been linked automatically to the uploaded file, but in the event this had to be done manually. Someone remarked that the website was a Rolls-Royce on the outside held together inside with sticky tape and string. The idea of an online permission form also stretched the conceptual framework of the Monash Human Ethics Committee, but they eventually embraced it and now recommend it to other researchers working online. There were several basic flaws in this research design. Firstly, I vastly overestimated the technological capacity of our intended subjects. Only one person submitted their own story as a sound file online. Those who wanted to raise their voices rather than their pens or fingers preferred our second option, an interview conducted by an oral historian. The online submission process did prove a useful way of collecting these interviews. Oral historians in Perth and northern New South Wales, and I think we had one from Darwin, could actually upload the stories, their recordings, as readily as those in Victoria and South Australia. Hoping still for self-directed testimonies, we asked the oral historians whom we hired to encourage their subjects to tell their own stories with as little direct questioning as possible. In some cases this worked well, in others less so. Several participants phoned me after their interviews to complain that the interviewer hadn't been very helpful, and there was something important they'd forgotten to say. In the end, we had 25 sound files uploaded to the website and 50 written testimonies. We also underestimated the impact of the data collection process, the impact on the data collection process of the intensely politicised atmosphere into which it was launched. Let me take a few steps backwards to explain the historical context. Adoption has long been a vexed question within Australian politics. Politicians have come under pressure to right individual wrongs and/or amend offending legislation. For most of the 20th century, this pressure came from people who had adopted or who wanted to adopt. The first two waves of adoption legislation in the 1920s and the 1960s were driven by the demands of adoptive parents for secrecy and security of tenure. In the 1970s, when the supply of locally born babies dried up, the concerns of those intending parents turned to adoption from overseas, and powerful pressure groups developed with close links to particular politicians. From the late 1970s, other groups formed to press for reform of the secrecy legislation, first among the adoptee community, and then amongst mothers separated or parents separated by adoption. Adoptive parents groups opposed these reforms and clashed publicly with reform advocates at seminars and national conferences. By the mid-80s, hostility was such that adoptive parents withdrew from public debate, though they maintained some political traction through their links to now mostly conservative politicians. Their ongoing pressure meant that the reforms won by adoptees and mothers groups in the various states across the next decade were limited by exceptions and exclusions. The reform groups continued to press for further reform and increasingly for public recognition of the suffering that adoption had brought to them. This movement for recognition and recompense was led by mothers separated by adoption. In two states, New South Wales and Tasmania, parliamentarians responded with inquiries into adoption practices which functioned as platforms for mothers and adoptees to tell their stories of pain and suffering. And I'll go into that a little further down the track. A few adopting mothers made submissions to these inquiries, presenting adoption as a way of rescuing children in need and asking for more government support for adoption. But the great majority of submissions came from people who believed they'd been harmed by adoption and condemned it as a cruel and unnatural practice. The adoptee community's moment in the spotlight, the people who adopted community's moment came in 2005. Bronwyn Bishop, one of Tony Abbott's two bishops, established a parliamentary inquiry shaped by the concern of parents who were critical of the administration of overseas adoption in Australia. Hundreds of couples wrote about the difficulties placed in their way by Australian bureaucracy and the eventual joys of parenting. But even here, people separated by adoption seized the opportunity to tell their stories too, in order to condemn adoption, whether in domestic or inter-country. The public performance of the pain and suffering of adoption took place in a wider context still of public grief and government response. In the decade 1995 to 2005, 3 national inquiries into the treatment of children in state care revealed suffering, neglect and mistreatment on a massive scale. All 3 reports recommended that the Commonwealth Government should offer a formal apology to the people involved, to Aboriginal children separated from their families, to child migrants brought without consent from Britain and Malta, and to Australian children who had experienced institutional care. The Rudd Labor government responded with 2 national apologies, in 2008 for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country, and in 2009 both to the child migrants and all children institutionalised over the previous century. An apology for all these injustices to you as children who were placed in our care. Mothers and children separated by adoption argued that their experience was very much the same as that suffered by Aboriginal families and institutionalised children, and pressed hard for this to be recognised by government. They were initially led to believe that they would be included in the second apology, and when they were not, their omission caused anger and sorrow. So when we launched our website late in 2009, there was no chance of achieving the unbiased, fully representative collection of adoption stories that we had envisaged. Our very claim to be unbiased roused suspicion. People assumed that if we were not with them, we must be against them. Shirley's institutional affiliation with the Australian Catholic... Shirley Swain was one of my co-writers. Her affiliation with the Australian Catholic University generated emails accusing our project of being funded by the Catholic Church, who of course were an enemy. We worked hard to reassure potential contributors, contacting key activists from the various groups and speaking to meetings. Our greatest success in bypassing the established battle lines came from talks we gave on ABC local radio, which usually attracted people wanting to contribute who weren't necessarily involved with the groups. But overall, the results were disappointing. We drew only one professional contributor. The Association of Social Workers didn't want any contact with us, and even sympathetic social workers declined to put anything in writing on the website. We attracted only a handful of stories from families who had adopted, mostly success stories. Personal contact produced several interesting interviews with women who regretted their decision to adopt, but all preferred not to post these on the website. The parents separated by adoption who chose to contribute were nearly all activists in the various groups opposed to adoption. We were contacted by a woman who had given up her child for adoption and felt very strongly, unlike all the others, that this had been the right decision. She too didn't want to make her story public. Adoptees were the readiest to contribute, but after 6 months of collecting, we realised we had no stories from the most recent group of adoptees, those brought to Australia by inter-country adoption. To fill this gap, we employed an inter-country adoptee to interview fellow adoptees with some success. For much of the time, our collection period ran parallel with the sitting of the Senate inquiry into the Commonwealth contribution to former forced migration policies and practices, established in November 2010 and reporting in February 2012. The apology recommended by this inquiry was delivered by Prime Minister Julia Gillard in May 2013. It was brilliant. If you want to read it, anyway, sorry, I'm distracting myself. The implementation of its other recommendations is ongoing and, I may say, contested. That story is nowhere near finished. This inquiry established a website which eventually published 418 submissions, representing all kinds of people involved in adoption, institutional and activists of all colours. Though it must be said that neither our site nor the Senate inquiry site can claim to have attracted contributions from many people touched by adoption but not involved in one or another of these activist groups. Certainly the self-selection involved meant that those whose adoption experience was not a problem in their lives didn't bother to speak out. And that was many people. The presence of the Senate site and its political importance to activists probably diminished the relevance of our site for potential contributors. In the end, we collected 75 online contributions. Actually, there was a few more than those, and several people didn't really realise what going online meant, despite the fact we tried to explain it to them very carefully. And we would get an email saying, "My mother-in-law has just read what I put up and I didn't want it to, and can you take it down, please?" So despite the entire ethics process being directed towards people understanding what they were doing, they didn't. So we actually had a few more, but they've been taken down. So of that 75, 44 were from adoptees, 7 of these being inter-country, 22 were from parents separated by adoption, and only 8 from families who had adopted. So reading the stories. First of all, the adoptees. The local adoptees contributing to our site often spoke from a position of grief and suffering and a sense of betrayal. Not all of them, but that was the majority. For those whose discovery of their adopted status came late, the knowledge became in itself a central and often damaging experience. Those who grew up with the knowledge describe less trauma, but still suffered a sense of confused identity. Most have attempted to resolve this by searching for their birth families, and particularly their birth mothers. Often this search has been delayed until the death of the parents who adopted them, out of respect for the adoptive parents' feelings. Very few describe their adoptions as failures, and most are grateful for the care of their adopted parents. But they regret, often passionately, the loss of the family into which they were born and into which they can only rarely return. And again, I must add that those people, I suspect strongly that those people who have made the re-entry into the family, again, haven't seen it as necessary for themselves to actually contribute to the website. And personal contact has produced some stories which are of success, you know, so we can't, we're not claiming any sort of representativity. The stories of the ICA, the inter-country adoptees, are rather different. The fact that they were sought out by our interviewer rather than self-selected makes them immediately less confessional. But beyond this, the experiences they report are not located in trauma. There are problems common to this group. Most have suffered from ignorant racism. Many have not felt a sense of identity before meeting up with other ICA adoptees or Asian students as they grew up. Most have made the trip back home to Asia in search of a feeling of belonging, and most report not finding it there. More clearly than the local adoptees, these people tend to embrace a sense of transience, of dual identity, as their defining characteristic, and that which they share with other people in the group, and they have a very strong network that they're part of. Okay, mothers separated by adoption. There are a couple of fathers, but it's predominantly mothers. These stories are not easy to read nor to hear. Most follow much the same plot. An unmarried underage girl discovers she's pregnant, and now I'm using words from the stories on the website. I was terrified, frightened and alone. I couldn't tell anyone due to the shame. She is sent by family or takes herself to some kind of mostly unpleasant home for unmarried mothers. My father is disgusted with me, and soon I am on my way to Newcastle and a government-run home for unmarried mothers. She finds then or earlier that she's expected to give up her baby for adoption. We were actively discouraged from talking about our babies. There was a strict adoption-only policy. She doesn't accept this. Feeling my baby move inside me made my pregnancy real for me, and I planned a life with my baby. But she finds no alternatives. I kept hoping that some miracle would happen and I would be able to keep my baby, but no such miracle took place. In hospital, she suffers lengthy, painful and generally unsupported labour. Quote, during my 21-hour labour I was left totally alone and was in so much pain that I wanted to die. She's usually blocked from seeing her baby at birth. At the moment of birth, the midwife held a pillow in front of my face so I wouldn't see the baby I'd carried for 9 months. And after birth, her requests to see and hold her child are usually ignored. Like so many mothers, I did not see my baby, I did not hold her or kiss her or even smell her. Her claims to keep him, her baby, are brushed aside. I was told I was selfish to want to keep my child. If I loved him, I'd want him to have 2 parents and a better life than I could give him. Invariably, she comes to believe that she has no option but to give up her child. The JP pushed the papers towards me, and through my tears I signed. Returning to the family that rejected her pregnancy, she is told to forget about it, get on with her life. She grieves for the lost child, usually in silence and continuing shame, for 20 or 30 years, and then begins actively searching for her or is found by her. The reunion is only rarely the beginning of a satisfying relationship. Days or weeks or months after the first meeting, the son or daughter throws out the impossibly hostile question, "But how could you have given me up?" How were we as historians to read these stories? How are we to understand their commonalities? Clearly, the stories from people separated by adoption reflect both common experience and a common interpretation of that experience. More than 3/4 of the mothers contributing to our site can be identified as being or having been actively involved with a mutual support group, and the same is probably true of the adoptees. Support groups have helped people separated by adoption to break their silence and search for each other since the 1970s. From the early 1980s, all these groups used the language of trauma offered them by sociologists and psychologists. Thus, they've worked within an understanding that telling one's story is part of the self-healing process. And it seems likely that the stories on our website have been thoroughly rehearsed within these communities of suffering. Some have also been told to earlier inquiries or mounted on the Senate inquiry website. And almost certainly they've been told at public rallies and to persuade politicians to the cause. Speaking truth to power is what Julia Gillard called it in her apology. They represent a long tradition of testimony developed and delivered within the activist communities over the last decades. To acknowledge this is not to diminish the factual significance of the stories. They have commonalities of plot because their tellers have undergone similar experiences. Forced adoption was a reality for single mothers and their babies before the 1980s. It was a choiceless choice, in the words of a Jewish oral historian. But the significance of these stories goes far beyond the evidence as fact. In Portelli's words, the unique and precious element which sources like these force upon the historian is the speaker's subjectivity, and beyond that, a cross-section of the subjectivity of a special group or class. As Portelli says, they tell us not just what people did, but what they wanted to do, what they were doing, what they believed they were doing, and what they now think they did. These storytellers force upon the reader and the historian a kind of group subjectivity based in memories of what they wanted to do but failed to do, coloured by what they believed they were doing, and shaped by their needs into a new truth that their children were not relinquished, but stolen from them by forced adoption. It was clear to us as historians that we had a clear duty to bring this truth to the world, and especially to those children whose mothers still grieve their loss. Now, finally, writing. I haven't gone very much into the writing, and I'm perfectly happy to talk about that some more, and we're going to have a lot of time for questions because I'm just about there. This insight has been shaped, this insight that we had the duty to tell the story, particularly so the whole of the Australian society could understand that these people had no choice. This insight has been central to the planning and writing of The Market in Babies. The title and its shaping metaphor didn't come from the testimonies on the website. It actually came from an insight that Shirley Swain drew from her research. Shirley essentially read thousands and thousands of advertisements on trove in the classified ads of the journals, the newspapers, from about 1860 right through to 1950. You might not think this would be correct, but babies were offered on as they started off in well, I won't go into it, but you know, I mean, they were in the buy and sell columns, and you know, so, and there was money involved. Very often there was money given, but in the beginning, the people that there was a preponderance of parents who couldn't keep their children who were offering them from adoption, and about 1942 appears to be the magic year in which it switches, and there's a lot more people wanting babies than there are offering them. I need to investigate 1942. So Shirley realised that there was a real market in babies, as I said, driven in the first decades by the desperation of parents unable to care for their children, and in the later decades by the preferences of prospective parents wanting to create families by adoption, which I could also talk more about. But the voices of those who suffered adoption shaped our decision to conclude our project by writing not an academic history of adoption, but a short popular history, without much scholarly paraphernalia. We saw it's only 50,000 words. I, in fact, tried not to have footnotes, but I didn't get away with that. But they're written in as accessible style as possible, and you know, a minimum. We saw our task of bringing the experience of those separated by adoption to as broad an audience as possible. My teenage daughter, no, it's not a teenage daughter, my rather more than that daughter read it for me, as she has previously read some of my things, and told me, "That's no good, Mum, that's too long, that's too big a word, why have you got that?" So I brought everybody's more or less into line as far as I could, so that it was a fairly straightforward narrative written in... And actually simple English can convey the complexities just as well as more complicated English. To explain the experience of relinquishing a child to adoption was our central aim, to explain it to a generation who just couldn't believe the lack of choice involved in that experience, to tell the children who couldn't forgive their mothers that there was no fault to forgive. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions on any aspect of that or what I've missed out.
You probably heard that. Thank you, Marian. That was absolutely terrific, and heaps of issues embedded in there. And I can still see Bill Bunbury's hands up already, so Mandy's got the mic.
Thanks, Marian. That was a wonderful account. You commented that some of the interviewers were not helpful in those situations. I think it'd be interesting to know what they failed to do. No,
it was our fault. Sorry, I should have explained that better. Yeah. We told them to make it as much a personal testimony as possible, not to direct them. I mean, we gave them a list of things to talk about, but we said, if possible, sit back and don't intervene. Some of them did that more than others, and in a couple of cases, the non-interventionary ones, the mother got in touch with me twice afterwards and said that really they didn't think the interview had been terribly helpful. And one of them said, "And I forgot a whole lump of the story, and she should have asked me about it," you know. So that was the problem. No, I think I'd read too much sort of Jewish oral history stuff about testimony, and I think I was led slightly down the garden path about the way that might work.
Thanks.
Marian, thank you. That was fantastic talk. I'm really interested in how popular culture shapes the way that we view these stories. And when you were telling the story about the woman who forcibly gave up her baby, I was sitting here almost moved to tears. It was such a sad story. But on Thursday night, my television viewing has me almost moved to tears through laughter at a story called Bogan something or other, which is...
I've missed that, I must...
And I'm just very interested in, you know, how the popular culture influences both the people who come forward to tell their stories and how the general public actually view these adoption stories.
Yes. Well, I'm also really, really grateful that the Trove carried the Women's Weekly now up to 1975 because we were able to use that and fill in the gap and to actually, not just Women's Weekly, we also looked at Women's Idea and a few other ones, but a very important part of our story has been the way that popular culture has changed people's understandings of adoption. And it's very clear that the shift that happens, for example, the shift that happens in the 1970s, where all of a sudden, I mean, over a period of 3 or 4 years, people just stop offering their babies for adoption. Now, one of the important things there is the mother's supporting benefit, but even more important, I think, is a changing attitude reflected in the Women's Weekly. And the advice columns in all of the newspapers always advise people to give up their babies for adoption. You can find every year, you know, a couple where they say, you know, what you've got to do is tell your parents about it and book yourself into a baby's home and they'll be all right, and then you can get on with your life after you've given it up for adoption. Very much exactly what the social workers were saying. But in about 72, the first break is there's a story in the Women's... I think there's a break earlier in the New Idea, but the one I actually used in the book, there's a story about a career girl who actually kept her baby because she couldn't bear the thought of not knowing what would happen to her afterwards. And this is reported with applause, you know, without any condemnation whatsoever. And after that, that increases. And they actually are important, the Women's Weekly, in helping establish the mothers' groups because they ran a story and then invited people to write in about their adoption experiences, and many, many, many mothers wrote in at that point, and that might have been their first, and then they actually then got in touch with each other. So there's been a very active role, and it goes on the same way. The telling truth to power very often happened in the pages of the popular press, and recently, from about 1990, it's happened on television. And it's extremely important that that's happened on television. Some people said in their stories, I didn't think about adoption for years and years and I just buried it, mothers, but then I saw a program on the ABC in 1992, I think it was, in which a mother talked about her experiences, and I sat and cried for 3 days and felt much better and joined one of the groups. So yes, I mean, there's an interplay, a continual interplay between what's happening politically and the kind of shaping that is actually being done by popular culture.
I'm Pauline Payne, and I actually used to work in social work before I became a historian. Marian's given a background of what it's like for the mother, looking back. I just want to add something about what it's like for an adoptive child trying to trace their parent. Imagine, from a research point of view, that you're trying to trace your parents and that they were actually people involved in World War II in the services, in different services, and the mother had never told the father. The father never knew. So imagine what it's like as an adoptee trying to trace from Australia your parents who lived in Britain originally, and you spend a couple of decades of your adult life trying to find out. In this case, when the person did finally find out where the mother came from, she had already died, and the family did not wish to ignore, just believe it or not, even in this day and age, could not accept that their relative, the woman, had an illegitimate child. So they simply refused to make contact with the adoptee. Now that's a pretty difficult. In this case, there's a happy ending to the person, the adoptee did find the father through service organisations, and so that was a sort of a great thing. But the research issues of finding your parent can be extremely difficult.
But they are much helped now by all the online stuff, and in fact, it's really, once a person wants to search now, it's really not all that difficult. In more recent times, yeah. But there are lots of stories like that.
Yeah. Marian, thank you for the paper. Did you discover at all as to whether the sort of the Irish practice that we've heard of, which is the woman would give birth and then the church, in a sense, would sell, the money would change hands. The baby would then go to a wealthy family, or essentially a sale would happen, particularly from the United States. Did money change hands by churches or agencies in Australia, and was that a factor at all in the approach? Yeah,
it changed hands, but it was for services given, for services rendered. It was never presented. It was illegal from the 1920s for money to change hands. And for them to be offered, and for that frame. But it went on. It still continued, mainly in terms of the local Catholic mother's home. The mother's homes actually profited in two ways, because once if there was any money coming into the mother from government, and there sometimes was, they kept that, and then when the baby was offered up for adoption, they asked for a fee, which was for services rendered. So yes, it wasn't quite as blatant as the sale thing, but it was exactly what was happening.
Oh, sorry, that's right. Next thing, I'll deliver this up here.
Hi, thank you. Great talk. And really fascinating, that intersection between the current politics and how you're able to look at, like, the shaping of memory. I was just thinking, doesn't this history as well, it has to be linked to that whole stigma of illegitimacy and how ostracised those people could often be?
Yes.
We kind of forget that.
Yes, yes. The treatment that the mothers received was framed in a sort of a punitive mode. And really, I think the idea was to make it so, to stigmatise their experience so that other people wouldn't get pregnant. I mean, that was the frame that people were operating in. But that was one of the things that changed enormously fast in the early 1970s. From 1969, you have a group called Single Mothers, the Council for Single Mothers and Their Children, and they led the charge on the illegitimacy issue. And they hadn't given up their babies, but they were very, very sympathetic to the single mothers. And they changed the law, first of all state-wise and then generally, so that illegitimacy, you didn't get illegitimate stamped on your birth certificate any longer. Yep. Yeah, there was a bit of a problem there. It varied. Yes, because they said that, yeah, they were not single mothers in the sense because their babies had gone. But they did do a lot of work. And they actually were the ones who also talked to the Human Relations Commission, which was a very significant body as well. And I need to get that into my story when I actually write it up too.
Marian, thank you very much indeed. As one of the contributing adopting mothers to your project, I'm obviously very interested to hear what you've got to say. Before I do say my question, can I just tell you, and anybody else who's interested, that on Tuesday I'm spending the morning with the birth auntie of my adopted son. I would be spending it with his natural parents if they were well, but they're not. So there are some very happy endings.
There are. I don't think we captured enough of them for the reasons that I've said.
No. And really what I'd like to ask you to do is to talk a little bit more about people like me, the adopting mothers, and,
yes,
and the difficulties that they faced when, the reality of what they'd done became clear.
Became clear, yes.
But I wanted to just tell people that when I first made inquiries about adoption, it was because I'd read a newspaper article in a Tasmanian newspaper that talked about Tasmanian babies being exported to Victoria. And that made me angry, it made me concerned, and, the rest is history in your project.
Indeed.
But if you could
yes,
focus a little on...
We, in the first section of the book, is about experience, and that's where I tell first of all the story of the adoptees and then the story of the mothers, and I try and tell the story of all the mothers because it seems to me that both groups of mothers suffered from an ideology which was very strong in Australian society, which said that A, if you weren't a mother, you weren't a woman, and B, that if you were a mother by illegitimate means, then you're a bad mother. And that set the framework then for the self-understandings of mothers and the framework for action by governments, by social workers, what you read in the press. So I see both groups as having had their choices very firmly directed by social pressure. Now, that doesn't mean that a lot of people didn't act according to the way they felt inside themselves, but they were very much constrained, much more constrained than women are now, hugely more constrained than women are now, by ideals of motherhood which carried some punitive aspects. Is that a reasonable response? I'm not sure your mic is on. Sorry.
Thanks for your talk. You highlighted one of the problems with inquiries of this sort, and particularly government inquiries where people who've had positive experiences don't come forward, and only those who feel hard done by and want to change the system tend to come forward. And this is particularly the case with where the activity might involve some criminality, like the current inquiries on child abuse.
Yes.
So how would you suggest from your work that a more balanced perspective might come forward?
It's terribly difficult. At the present moment, what are they called? The Family Institute for Family Studies, AIFS, are running a great big project, an oral history project like our own, with the deliberate effort to try and bring in the voices of those people who don't feel that they've suffered. They're not being very successful. They've advertised madly, but as I understand it, they're not tapping in to that silent group out there. So I don't know how you do it in any kind of aggregative mode. Certainly you can do it by finding people and talking to them, but then it's still, the issue then still is that you really have no sense of a representative whole, and I don't know that it's possible, particularly in cases where there is so much personal feeling involved.
Most enlightening. I sat here with horror as you were talking about the teenager who was forced into the girls' home, and blah blah, and then forced to sign adoption papers. So she was not only forced to give up the child she wanted, in a very cruel sort of way, she was also forced to sign when she was underage.
Yes, the present, it's the illegality of that which is something that is moving a lot of the people now, and there's a class action being planned in Sydney against, I think it's Anglicare, I'm not absolutely sure, on that exact issue, that they were forcing people underage to...
Hurrah.
Yeah.
Hurrah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. I was just wondering if you looked in other collections of oral history collections, because I was thinking in South Australia there's a really powerful interview with a Vietnamese baby that was brought out after the war. So did you look at it?
Not as much as we should have. We didn't pick that one up. I picked up a few in the National Library, but we didn't really do a systematic search of all the oral history collections, and that would have helped. We were so focused on, making our own source base. That was the problem. So yes, that would be something we should have done, I think.
Thank you very much, Marian. We've only recently discovered in the last year that a very close family member was one of those Tasmanians that was shuffled off to Victoria in the 1920s. She's now almost 93, and she still doesn't know that she was adopted, and that was Irish Catholics, and there's a lot of secrecy involved with that.
Yes.
And it's too late to tell her now anyway. I just wondered what would have been the oldest adoptees that you would have encountered, and how did they react at finding out at such an age?
I think the oldest person on the website's 85, and they wrote a story.
And your website, please.
Yeah. They wrote a story which was pretty matter of fact, but they actually had known that they were adopted all the way through. The group that didn't know that they were adopted tend to be that middle-aged group, and for many of them the discovery of adoption was dreadful. But the other thing is that in that earlier period, obviously not the ones that had gone interstate, but there was usually, it was quite often known in the area who had adopted whom. The children didn't necessarily know, but when they went back and looked, you know, they found that Auntie Jo did know, and they were just down the road. So it really is from the 50s and 60s that we get the most agonised stories about the effects of secrecy.
And could I have your website, please? Is it on?
Is it there? No, there's the publishing one. Oh dear, I should have done that. Contact me and I'll give you the website. I must say at this point, I'm marian.quartly@monash.edu. And I should say at the moment that we haven't translated all the stories across. There's another 15 that I've found that didn't get translated, you know, part of the... They're all going onto a permanent base. That's what's happening. So next week I'm going to be chasing up the 15 stories that I've found. I've actually found them on another server, and we'll get them in. So they're not all there yet. So give it a while, and then they'll all be available. Sorry, I should have given you the website. I forgot about that. Yep.
Thanks, Marian.
Oh, hi, Al.
It's lovely to hear you talk about the project. I've been watching you for the last few years, struggling with it and tussling with lots of tough issues. I was just thinking about the comment before about other collections that will have adoption stories of different sorts. And as increasingly as state and national projects get digitised, oral history projects, and put up online and have finding aids like time summaries and transcripts, it's actually not going to be too hard because of the word adoption or adopt is such a universal word. You're going to pick up a lot of those stories from different perspectives.
Yes.
And you'll get them where their project's not about adoption, where people talk about it in much more everyday ways. And I suspect that way you'll start to get more of the positive stories.
Yes.
And I suppose one project I'm thinking of that you might eventually want to look at was the Australia 1938 project, the Bicentennial Oral History Project, partly because, and it's very interesting, it says something about the late 70s when it was conceived and the interviews started to be done between late 70s, early 80s. They actually struggled when they were developing their question guide about how they would deal with sex and sexuality in the interviews. And they ended up having a section of 4 optional questions, which I have to say a lot of the interviewers were too shy or embarrassed or concerned to ask. One was about miscarriage, one was about adoption, one was about homosexuality, and I can't for the life of me remember the 4th one. But when they did ask, people talked. I mean, they were worried that they were interviewing these older people and the older people would, no, heaven forbid that they would talk about these things. Given the opportunity, people talked very freely and willingly, and the concern was mostly on the side of interviewers worried about being embarrassed, I think, and said something about the times.
Yes.
But the nice thing about those projects where people did talk about it, because they had an incredibly structured question guide that many of the interviewers followed fairly rigorously, you can actually find in the same chunk of the interviews the stuff about those 4 questions.
That's fabulous.
So, you'll find adoption stories directly through there where the question was asked.
And they're adoption stories that don't come from a sense of outrage or, no, that's wonderful. I will have a look at that, thank you. Are they on the National Library website?
They're increasingly, it's a really hard project, it has been a very hard collection of 600 interviews to use because they were all done by cassettes and only some of them had time summaries and even less had transcripts. The interviews themselves are going up online with catalogue entries which probably won't help you. You really just, you've got to go to the National Library at the moment. Until someone gives the money to document those interviews properly with time summaries, they're going to be hard to access other than going there.
Yeah, I did look at the National Library's general collection of stories and picked up a few that way, but I know that there are some there that have adoption stories in them that you can't pick up from the catalogue, so thank you. There was a gentleman in the front who had his hand up too. Yeah.
Well,
This one first, and you, and that'll be the last time.
Fantastic. Yes, I can read it. Yep. Good, I'll read it out in a minute. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I've just been given, thank goodness, the actual web reference for the page. Bear in mind that it's not quite all there. It's a really good collection. It's got a huge collection of primary sources listed there. So if anybody was interested in adoption, they can go into all those other sources as well. What else is there? Lots of stuff, but it's not quite all across yet. It's Arts Online, all one word, artsonline.monash, MONASH, edu.au/history of adoption, all one word. Actually, if you type in history of adoption, you'll get it. Yeah, and Monash. And then, thank you, you've just tried it. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. I just had a question about men and whether you had spoken to any men and whether there was anything in the system about men having to give up children if they were left, say, as widows or single men if the lady didn't.
There is quite a strong group of fathers separated by adoption. They both have an independent organisation and they are strong within a couple of the other organisations. There's not a lot of them, but they're very, very committed and interested. And sorry, you'll find their submissions, a couple on our website, or maybe 4, and you'll find them in all of the other collections as well. Sometimes they're men who always wanted to keep the baby and couldn't for some reason, and so their story is very much like the mother's. Other times they're ones who've actually come to be activists because either of being contacted either by mothers or by their children. So, yes, they do have a role.
Is that? Oh, yeah. Just harking back to what you said earlier about whether it was possible now anyway to find people who, my interpretation of what you said was at least who are untouched by, in terms of how to interpret their own experience.
Yes.
Untouched because the pressures to be a good mother or a good father or would if you didn't care, if you were happy.
Yes.
And glad, then suddenly you might start asking yourself, it's sort of like reflexivity, I guess it might be a sort of problem, or that sort of thing. But again, your archive, I guess, could show what people felt before affected by the deluge of victimology almost, possibly, I don't know.
Yes, and I take the point from the lady up the back that we didn't really search state collections. And again, I think that would be useful. What I'm going to do about this is I'm going to write this more general book, which will have a chapter about adoption, more like an essay chapter. So I'm not going out looking for huge amounts more quantitative research. If anybody wants to do that, I can help them. But I'm very interested in hearing some more voices. So I will be looking. Thank you.
Marian, thank you. That was fabulous. What a wonderful session.